Say it louder, Daniel Whitmore said in smooth, deliberate German, his lips curling into a smile that never reached his eyes. Maybe she'll understand it this time. The words floated across the private dining room like expensive perfume, subtle, sharp, and meant to linger, and for a brief second, the clinking of crystal glasses and low jazz from the corner piano seemed to dim beneath the weight of his tone. A few of his colleagues chuckled, not because it was funny, but because power has a way of making cruelty sound like confidence, and at the edge of the table stood Ava Johnson, posture straight, expression calm, a tray balanced effortlessly in her hands. As if nothing had been said at all, as if she hadn't just understood every single word. The restaurant itself was the kind of place where deals were made in whispers and broken with a handshake, where the city skyline stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise only a few could afford. And tonight, Daniel owned the room the way he always did, tailored navy suit, watch that cost more than most people's yearly rent, voice trained to command attention without ever needing to raise it. To him, people were either useful or invisible, and servers, especially, existed somewhere below both categories, background noise in a world designed for men like him. Ava moved quietly between chairs, refilling a glass here, adjusting a plate there, her presence precise but unseen, and if anyone had bothered to look closer, they might have noticed the way her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, the way she absorbed everything. Every word, every glance, every careless assumption made at her expense, but no one ever did, because invisibility is easiest to maintain when no one believes you matter. Daniel leaned back in his chair, continuing in German, his tone light, conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than dissecting a human being standing 3 feet away, and his guests followed along, some nodding, some smirking, all complicit in the quiet performance of superiority that money so often rehearses. And still, Ava said nothing, not because she didn't understand, but because she did, and understanding, in that moment, was her advantage. The chandelier above cast a soft amber glow across the table, reflecting off polished silverware and expensive plates, and beneath that warm light, something colder was forming, something no one at that table could see yet, not even Daniel, who believed he had already defined the story simply by speaking it aloud, because what he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that the woman he had just reduced to a punchline had already memorized every word he said, had already measured the room, the timing, the stakes, and had already decided exactly when she would answer, not as a waitress, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who understood the language he used not just to speak, but to hide. And in that quiet, controlled silence, Ava Johnson wasn't shrinking, she was waiting. And sometimes, the most powerful move in a room full of noise is choosing the exact moment to break it. Daniel did not stop, because men like him rarely do when the room is still laughing with them. He lifted his glass slightly, swirling the deep red wine as if the motion itself reinforced his control, then continued in German with a tone that suggested amusement but carried something sharper underneath, and the others leaned in just enough to follow, their attention locked not on the woman standing beside them but on the man performing for them. And Ava stepped forward with quiet precision, refilling his glass without interrupting, her movement steady, her breathing even, her eyes lowered just enough to match the role they had already assigned to her. What none of them could see was the calculation behind that calm, the way her mind traced each word, each phrase, storing them not with emotion but with clarity, as if she were listening to a recording she knew would matter later. A few seats down, one of the younger investors adjusted his tie and smirked, responding in broken German that earned him a quick nod from Daniel, and for a moment, the conversation shifted into a rhythm that felt exclusive, a private language used as a barrier rather than a bridge. And that was the point, because language, in rooms like this, was never just communication. It was hierarchy, it was access, it was power. Ava turned slightly, stepping back toward the service station, but her pace slowed just enough to keep them within earshot, her presence fading into the background while her awareness sharpened. And behind the polished counter, beneath the soft hum of refrigeration units and the faint clatter of dishes, she allowed herself a single breath deeper than the rest, not to steady nerves, but to anchor timing. Across the room, the skyline shimmered in the glass, reflections overlapping with the figures inside, creating a layered illusion where everything looked larger than it was. And Daniel's voice cut through it again, lighter now, confident, unaware that the performance he believed he controlled had already shifted in ways he could not measure. One of his partners leaned closer and asked a question in English, something about the contract they were preparing to finalize. And Daniel responded first in English, briefly, then switched back to German as if to underline a point, as if to remind everyone who in the room held the upper hand. And this time, there was a detail in his words that Ava caught with precision, something specific, something legal, something that did not align with the confident image he projected, and her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray before relaxing again, because now it was no longer just about what he had said about her. It was about what he had revealed without realizing it. She returned to the table when called, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, and Daniel barely glanced at her as he spoke, dismissing her presence even as she stood within reach, and that was when he made his quietest mistake, a sentence spoken quickly, almost lazily, in German, something he assumed would dissolve into the air unheard, but Ava heard it clearly, every word, every implication, and in that moment, the shape of the night shifted again, more defined now, more deliberate. She placed the final glass down, adjusted the angle of a plate by half an inch, then stepped back, her gaze lifting just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to see the entire table as a single frame, each person exactly where they believed they belonged, and for the first time that evening, Ava was not just observing the room, she was preparing to change it, not with volume, not with force, but with something far more precise, something Daniel had already handed her without knowing. And as the conversation turned back to numbers and projections, to signatures and expectations, the silence she carried was no longer passive. It was intentional, because timing, she understood, was not about speaking first, it was about speaking last, and when she finally did, there would be no translation needed. The waiter beside Ava whispered something about table 9 needing assistance, but she did not move immediately, because across the room the energy had shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and at Daniel's table the conversation had narrowed into something more focused, less performative, more transactional, the kind of tone that signaled decisions were about to be made. Daniel leaned forward now, elbows near the edge of the polished table. His voice lower, more controlled, and this time he stayed in English just long enough to outline the structure of the deal, numbers that sounded clean, confident, inevitable, and then, almost instinctively, he slipped back into German, not for clarity, but for concealment, and Ava felt it immediately, the shift from performance to strategy, the moment where truth often hides behind language. She moved again, this time toward a nearby station, picking up a fresh bottle she did not need, giving herself a reason to remain within range, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass of the window behind them, superimposed over the city lights like a ghost in a world that refused to see her, and still, she listened. Daniel spoke quickly now, assuming privacy where there was none, outlining a clause, referencing a condition, something about regulatory alignment that sounded smooth on the surface but carried a contradiction underneath. And one of the investors frowned slightly, not because he understood the German, but because he recognized the tone, the kind that suggested something was being said that not everyone in the room was meant to hear. Ava's grip on the bottle steadied, her posture unchanged, but inside, the pieces were no longer scattered, they were aligning, forming a pattern that was clearer with each sentence Daniel spoke. She remembered a lecture hall in Berlin, years ago, the echo of a professor's voice explaining how language could be used to obscure intent. How contracts could hide truth in plain sight if the listener did not know where to look, and she remembered choosing to learn anyway, to understand not just the words, but the structure behind them, because knowledge, she had learned early, did not ask for permission, it simply waited for someone willing to claim it. Back at the table, Daniel smiled again, switching briefly to English to summarize what he had just said, simplifying it, polishing it, presenting it as something harmless, something beneficial. And the investors nodded, because that was what people did. When confidence sounded like certainty, and certainty sounded like profit, and no one questioned a man who had already convinced them he could not be wrong, Ava stepped closer, setting the bottle down with quiet precision, her movements timed between sentences, invisible again in the rhythm of service. But now, the silence she carried was no longer just preparation, it was pressure, building slowly, deliberately, waiting for the exact point where it could no longer be ignored. One of the guests glanced at her briefly, then away, dismissing her presence as easily as breathing, and Daniel did not look at her at all, which made what came next inevitable, because the most dangerous moment in any room is when the person holding power believes no one else understands it. Ava adjusted the final glass, her fingers light against the crystal, then let her hand fall to her side, her gaze lifting just enough to meet the edge of Daniel's profile. Not directly, not yet, but close enough to measure distance, to calculate timing, and as the conversation moved toward agreement, toward signatures, toward the quiet confidence of men who believed the outcome was already decided, Ava Johnson reached the point she had been waiting for, the moment where silence had done its work, where listening had gathered everything it needed, and where the next word spoken in that room would no longer belong to Daniel Whitmore. It happened in a moment so quiet it almost went unnoticed, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes everything once it arrives, and just as Daniel reached for his glass again, preparing to seal the confidence he had built around the table, a voice cut cleanly through the air, calm, measured, unmistakably precise, and it did not belong to him. Ava did not raise her tone, she did not rush her words. She simply spoke in fluent German, each syllable sharp, controlled, carrying the kind of clarity that does not ask for attention but commands it anyway, and for the first time that night, the room did not react with laughter, it reacted with silence, real silence, the kind that lands heavy and stays. Daniel's hand paused midair, the glass hovering just inches above the table, and though he had not yet turned, the shift in his posture gave him away, a subtle tightening, a fraction of hesitation that had never been there before. Ava continued, her gaze steady now, no longer lowered, no longer hidden, and what she said was not emotional, not defensive, but exact, a repetition of his own words, translated not for understanding, but for exposure. Each sentence he had spoken moments earlier now delivered back into the room in a language everyone present could understand, and with every line, the air seemed to sharpen, the polished ease of the dinner cracking under the weight of something far more real. One of the investors leaned back slightly, his expression no longer amused but attentive, another glanced toward Daniel as if waiting for him to correct it, to dismiss it, to regain control the way he always did, but Daniel did not interrupt, because for the first time, interruption would not have saved him, it would have confirmed it. Ava did not rush, she did not embellish, she simply finished what he had started, and when the final sentence left her lips, she let the silence return. Not as absence, but as presence, something filled now with understanding, with recognition, with the unmistakable realization that the balance of the room had shifted. Daniel finally turned, fully now, his eyes meeting hers directly, and whatever confidence had defined him minutes earlier was no longer clean, no longer effortless, it was measured, recalculating, searching for ground that no longer felt stable. The skyline beyond the glass remained unchanged, light steady, distant, indifferent, but inside the room, every detail seemed sharper, every movement more deliberate, as if the illusion of control had been quietly removed. Ava did not step back, she did not retreat into the role they had given her, because that role no longer existed, not here, not now, and when she spoke again, still in German, her tone did not rise, but it carried something new, something undeniable, the authority of someone who understood exactly what had been said and exactly what it meant. She referenced the clause he had mentioned earlier, the one buried in language he assumed no one else would follow. And this time, when she translated, she did not just repeat, she clarified, pointing out the inconsistency, the legal gap, the detail that shifted the agreement from confident to questionable, and that was when the room truly changed, not because of her voice, but because of what her words revealed. One of the investors leaned forward now, asking a question in English, direct, sharp, no longer casual, and another reached for the document on the table, flipping pages with a focus that had not been there before. And Daniel, for the first time that night, did not lead the conversation, he followed it. Ava stepped back then, just one step, enough to return space to the table but not enough to disappear, and in that space, something irreversible settled, a quiet understanding that the person they had overlooked had not only heard everything, she had understood it better than anyone else in the room, and in doing so, she had changed the outcome before a single signature could be written. The question did not come from Daniel, and that was the first sign that control had already slipped from his hands. It came from across the table, measured, direct, spoken by a man who had been silent all evening but was now leaning forward with a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for risk, and he asked Ava to repeat the clause again, slowly, in English this time, and she did, her voice steady, unhurried, translating not just the words but the implication behind them, and as she spoke, the document in front of them transformed from a promise into a possibility of error. Something that required scrutiny rather than trust. Daniel exhaled softly, a controlled breath, the kind used to reset a narrative before it fractures, and he smiled, not the effortless smile from earlier, but one sharpened by calculation, and he responded in English, dismissing the concern with a smooth explanation about international alignment, about standard practice, about how nuances in translation often create confusion where none exists, and for a moment, the room hesitated. Because confidence, even when challenged, can still sound convincing when delivered by someone accustomed to being believed. Ava did not interrupt, she did not raise her voice, she simply waited until he finished, and then she spoke again, not to contradict him directly, but to clarify, returning briefly to German for a single phrase, then translating it herself, pointing out the precise wording, the legal distinction that did not align with what Daniel had just described, and this time, there was no hesitation in the room, because clarity removes the comfort of assumption. One of the investors flipped through the pages again, more urgently now. Another pulled out his phone, likely cross-checking terms, and the quiet hum of the restaurant seemed to recede even further as the table became its own contained world, focused, tense, no longer distracted by status or setting. Daniel leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the stem of his glass before stilling, and for a brief moment, he looked at Ava not as background, not as service, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and in that look was recognition, not of who she was, but of what she had just done. Ava held her position, neither advancing nor retreating, her presence balanced, deliberate. And when she spoke again, it was softer but no less precise, explaining how the clause could be interpreted under German regulations, how the phrasing introduced a risk that would not hold under scrutiny, and she did not accuse, she did not dramatize, she simply laid out the logic, step by step, the way someone does when they are not trying to win an argument, but reveal a truth. The man who had asked the question nodded slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern, and he turned to Daniel, not confrontational, but no longer convinced, asking for clarification that now carried weight, and Daniel answered, of course he did, because silence was not an option, but the rhythm was different now, less fluid, more deliberate, each word chosen with care rather than confidence. Around the table, the subtle alliances that had formed earlier began to shift, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to be felt, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and Ava saw it. Not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with understanding, because this was never about the moment he mocked her, it was about the moment the room realized they had trusted the wrong version of control. She stepped back then, just slightly, allowing the conversation to continue without her, because her role was not to dominate it, only to change it, and as the investors continued to question, to examine, to reconsider, the outcome that had seemed inevitable at the start of the evening no longer felt certain, and in that uncertainty, Daniel Whitmore was no longer the man who owned the room, he was the man trying to keep it. The conversation did not return to what it had been, because once doubt enters a room built on certainty, it does not leave quietly, it lingers, it spreads, it changes the way every word is heard, and now every sentence Daniel spoke was no longer accepted, it was evaluated, measured against what had already been revealed, and that shift, subtle but irreversible, was the kind that no amount of confidence could fully recover from. One of the investors closed the document slowly, not as a gesture of agreement, but as a pause, a signal that the discussion was no longer moving forward, and he leaned back, studying Daniel with a level of scrutiny that had not been there before, asking questions that were no longer framed as curiosity, but as concern, and each answer Daniel gave seemed to narrow rather than expand the space he once controlled. The skyline outside remained steady, lights glowing across the city, indifferent to what was unfolding inside, but at the table, the atmosphere had tightened, no longer warm, no longer performative, but precise, focused, and quietly critical. Ava stood near the edge of the room now, no longer part of the table but no longer invisible either, her presence acknowledged without being addressed, and in that space, she observed not with tension, but with clarity, because what was happening no longer required her to act, it required her to understand. Daniel adjusted his cuff slightly, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal the recalibration of someone used to regaining control, and he shifted his tone again, softer now, more collaborative, reframing the clause as a flexible point, something that could be amended, something that had always been open to interpretation, and for a moment, it almost worked, because adaptability, when performed well, can resemble transparency, but one of the partners did not nod this time. He asked for specifics, for written clarification, for confirmation that extended beyond verbal assurance, and that was when the rhythm broke again, because certainty cannot survive without trust, and trust had already been altered. Ava glanced briefly toward the table, her eyes moving from one face to another, reading the subtle changes, the way shoulders had shifted, the way posture had tightened, the way attention had moved away from Daniel and toward the details he could no longer fully control, and in that observation, there was no satisfaction, only recognition. Because this was not about a single moment, it was about a pattern being exposed. Daniel finally looked toward her again, not with dismissal, not with the careless indifference from earlier, but with something quieter, something more deliberate, and for a brief second, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, not of defeat, but of awareness, the realization that the person he had overlooked had changed the trajectory of the room in a way he could not reverse by simply speaking louder or smoother. The investors began to gather their thoughts, some exchanging glances, others reviewing the document again, but the energy had shifted from momentum to hesitation, from agreement to reconsideration, and in rooms like this, hesitation is often the first step toward withdrawal. Ava turned slightly, her role returning outwardly to what it had always been, a server moving through space, adjusting details no one else noticed, but internally, the moment had already passed, the point of impact had already been made, and she understood that what followed would not be immediate, not dramatic, but it would be decisive. Daniel spoke again, attempting to reframe the conversation, to redirect it toward the broader vision. The opportunity, the potential gain, but now those words carried less weight, because once the foundation is questioned, the structure above it cannot stand as easily as it once did. The room did not erupt. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, only something quieter, more powerful, a collective recalculation, and as the discussion slowed, as the certainty dissolved into careful consideration, one truth settled into place with quiet precision. Daniel Whitmore no longer controlled the outcome. And Ava Johnson, without ever raising her voice, had already decided it. No one said the deal was over, but everyone in the room felt it slipping, not in a dramatic collapse, not in a single decisive moment, but in the slow, unmistakable way certainty dissolves when trust is no longer intact. One of the investors finally closed his folder completely, the soft sound of leather against paper echoing louder than it should have in a room this refined, and he leaned forward with a measured expression, thanking Daniel for the presentation but suggesting that they revisit the terms after further review, and it was the tone, not the words, that carried the weight, because it was no longer a negotiation, it was a delay, and in this world, delays often mean endings. Daniel nodded. Of course he did, because refusing would have only confirmed what was already suspected, but the nod was different now, slower, heavier, stripped of the effortless confidence he had worn like a second skin earlier that evening, and as the others began to gather their belongings, the quiet choreography of departure unfolding with polite smiles and restrained conversation, the room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the outcome he could not control. Ava moved through the space again, collecting glasses, clearing plates, her presence returning to the rhythm of service, but something about the way people looked at her had changed, subtle, almost hesitant, as if they were recalibrating what they had missed, and one of the investors paused briefly as she passed, offering a small nod, not performative, not exaggerated, but real, and in rooms like this, recognition does not come with applause. It comes with acknowledgement. Daniel remained seated for a moment longer. After the others had stood, his gaze fixed on the table as if the answers might still be there, hidden between the lines he had once controlled, and when he finally looked up, his eyes found Ava across the room, not by accident, but with intention, and there was no smile this time, no performance, only a quiet, unspoken understanding that the narrative had shifted in a way he could not rewrite. Ava met his gaze briefly. Not confrontational, not lingering, just long enough to confirm what had already been established, and then she looked away, because this moment was not about holding his attention, it was about releasing it. The staff began resetting the table for the next reservation, replacing linens, adjusting settings, restoring the illusion of perfection that the evening had quietly disrupted, and within minutes, the space looked unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. But the people who had been part of it carried something different as they left, a memory not of luxury, but of clarity. Daniel stood, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he had started the night with, but the gesture no longer carried the same certainty, and as he walked toward the exit, the weight of the evening followed him, not visible, not spoken, but undeniable, because power, once questioned, does not return untouched. Ava placed the final glass on the tray, her movement steady, her expression calm, and when she turned toward the kitchen, the noise of the restaurant returned around her, the hum of conversation, the soft music, the distant clatter of dishes, life continuing exactly as it always had, and yet something had shifted. Something that did not need recognition to exist. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded attention, she had not stepped outside the role they had given her, and still, she had changed the outcome of a room full of people who believed they controlled everything. and as she disappeared through the service doors, one truth remained, quiet but absolute, that respect is not given by status, it is revealed by truth, and that night, truth had spoken in a language no one could ignore. The night did not end when the doors closed behind the last investor, because some moments do not stay inside the rooms where they happen, they follow people, they settle into memory, they reshape how things are seen long after the table has been cleared, and as Daniel stepped out onto the quiet city street, the cool air did not feel like relief, it felt like absence, the absence of control he had carried so effortlessly just hours before. The car waiting for him idled at the curb, polished, silent, ready to take him back to a world where his name still opened doors, where his voice still carried weight, but for a brief moment, he did not move, because the echo of that voice, her voice, still lingered in his mind, not loud, not confrontational, but precise, undeniable, and impossible to dismiss. Inside, the restaurant had already begun to reset itself, the evidence of the evening erased with practiced efficiency. Fresh linens replacing the old, glasses polished to perfection, the next reservation unaware of what had unfolded just an hour earlier, and in the kitchen, Ava moved through the familiar rhythm of closing tasks, her hand steady, her focus quiet, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, and in many ways, it had not, because to her understanding had never been extraordinary, it had been necessary. One of her co-workers glanced at her, curiosity flickering just beneath the surface, but no questions were asked, because some moments are not meant to be explained, they are meant to be recognized, and recognition does not always require words. Ava finished her shift the same way she always did, clocking out, tying her jacket, stepping into the night without announcement, without expectation, the city stretching around her in the same way it always had, busy, indifferent, alive, and yet, something within it felt slightly different, not because the city had changed, but because the story had. Across town, Daniel sat in the back seat of his car, the city lights passing in blurred reflections against the window, his phone resting in his hand, screen dark, because for once, there was no immediate call to make, no quick solution to deploy, no strategy that could instantly restore what had been altered, and that was the part he could not ignore. Not the loss of the deal, not the hesitation of the investors, but the realization that control had not been taken from him by force, it had been revealed as incomplete. He replayed the moment again, the way she had spoken, the clarity of it, the certainty, and for the first time in a long time, he recognized something he had overlooked, not just in her, but in the way he had moved through rooms like that one, assuming that silence meant absence, that invisibility meant lack of awareness, and now, that assumption no longer held. Back on the street, Ava walked past rows of storefronts, the glow of streetlights reflecting off the pavement, her pace unhurried, her expression unchanged, because she was not walking away from something, she was simply continuing forward, the same way she always had, and in that movement, there was no need for validation, no need for acknowledgement, because what had happened did not require recognition to be real. The night carried on, cars passing, conversations blending into the background, the city returning to its constant rhythm, and somewhere between the quiet of her footsteps and the distant hum of traffic, the truth of the evening settled into something simple, something lasting. That power can fill a room, but it cannot define it, not when someone inside it understands more than they are expected to, and is willing to let that understanding speak when it matters most. The next morning did not come with headlines or announcements, no dramatic reveal, no public unraveling of what had taken place the night before, because the most powerful shifts rarely need an audience to validate them, they simply move quietly through the people they touched, changing decisions, altering paths, rewriting outcomes without ever asking for recognition. Daniel sat at his office desk overlooking a skyline just as polished as the one from the restaurant, but the view felt different. Now, less like something he owned and more like something he observed, and in front of him lay the same documents, the same contract, the same opportunity that had once felt inevitable, now marked with notes, questions, and a hesitation that had not existed before, and for the first time in a long time, he did not rush to resolve it, because rushing would not restore what had been revealed. His phone buzzed with messages from the investors. Polite, professional, requesting clarification, suggesting revisions, none of them outright rejecting the deal, but none of them committing either, and in that space between interest and doubt, Daniel understood something he had ignored for years, that influence is not permanent, it is conditional, and once those conditions change, so does everything built on them. Across the city, Ava stepped onto a bus just after sunrise, the early light stretching across the windows. casting soft reflections on faces that carried their own stories, their own quiet battles, and she took a seat near the back, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her mind not replaying the night before, not analyzing it, not holding on to it, because for her, it had not been a moment of victory, it had been a moment of truth, and truth does not need to be relived to remain real. The bus moved through familiar streets, past coffee shops opening their doors, past people beginning their day, and in that ordinary rhythm, there was something steady, something grounding, a reminder that the world does not pause for any single moment, no matter how significant it feels, it simply continues, carrying those moments forward in quieter ways. Back in his office, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting from the papers to the reflection of himself in the glass, and for a brief second, the version he saw did not match the one he had built his reputation on. Not because he had lost everything, but because he had seen something he could not unsee, the gap between control and understanding, the difference between being heard and actually listening, and that realization did not come with comfort, it came with clarity. He reached for the document again, this time not to finalize it, but to examine it, line by line, detail by detail, the same way she had, and in that action, there was no audience, no performance, just a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened the night before had not been an interruption, it had been a correction. Ava stepped off the bus, blending into the flow of the morning crowd, her pace unhurried, her presence as unnoticed as it had always been, and yet, within that invisibility, there was something unshaken, something certain, because she did not need the world to recognize her to know her value, she had already proven it in a room that believed it could define her without ever seeing her. The city moved forward. As it always does, deals were made. Opportunities shifted, conversations continued, but somewhere within that movement, a quiet truth remained, one that did not need to be spoken again to exist, that power can fill a room, but it cannot replace awareness, and that the people most often overlooked are sometimes the ones who understand everything, and when they choose to speak, they do not just join the conversation, they change it entirely.